Join me tomorrow night on Twitch and on YouTube at 9 p.m. Eastern, where we will play NFL Trivia for cash prizes. Link to play below. And join me on Thursday night for the Hall of Fame game, where we will live stream all the action right here on YouTube. And now, on with our feature presentation. December 13th, 2010. One of the strangest games in the history of the Minnesota Vikings. Sure, the Vikings lost this game against the New York Giants by a final score of 21-3, but that's not why this game is remembered throughout NFL history more than a decade later. Number 1, Tavares Jackson, not Brett Favre, was the one who started this game for the Vikings, as due to Favre's injury, his streak of 297 consecutive starts, the longest of all time by a quarterback, and a record that might never be equaled or topped, was over. But number 2, as you can see, this game took place not in Minnesota, but rather in Detroit. Due to the Metrodome roof collapsing the day before the Vikings and Giants were originally set to play each other, the game got moved to Detroit and took place at Ford Field. Usually, when the Vikings play in Detroit, they are the road team. However, for this game, they were the home team, making this the first time ever that the Vikings played a home game outside of the state of Minnesota. It's not often that games take place in a different state than where the team usually plays, although it has happened before. The San Francisco 49ers played part of the 2020 season in Arizona due to COVID restrictions in the state of California. The San Diego Chargers played a Monday Night Football game in 2003 in Arizona due to wildfires. The New Orleans Saints played half of their 2005 season in Texas due to Hurricane Katrina, and the Buffalo Bills played a few games in Detroit over the years due to inclement weather. But for the Vikings, this was a first. An unusual first nonetheless, but a first. But what you might not know is that this almost happened before. As it turns out, roughly 40 years before, in 1969, the Minnesota Vikings almost played a home game outside of Minnesota. Imagine the Vikings playing a home game in, of all places, Kansas City. Imagine the Vikings playing a home game 436 miles away and going from Minnesota to Missouri for a home game. Well, that almost happened under a bizarre set of circumstances. And this is the story behind the strangest home field controversy, considering the circumstances, in the over 60-year history of the Minnesota Vikings franchise. Before I talk about the actual game in question and what went down, we need some context to understand the situation involving not just the stadium for the Vikings, but the situation with what seemed like the logical alternative to this issue. It's October 5th, 1969. It's week 3 of the brand new NFL season, and we've got a big game in the Central Division between the Minnesota Vikings and the Green Bay Packers. This is a very big game for both of these teams, as the Packers are 2-0 to start the new year off, while the Vikings enter this one with a 1-1 record following a blowout victory over the Baltimore Colts and a stunning upset loss at the hands of the New York Giants. Even though we're only in the 3rd week of the season, in many ways for the Vikings, this feels like a must-win game. In 1969, only the division winner made it to the playoffs, so no matter how good you were, if you did not win your division, you are not going to have a chance at competing for the Super Bowl. And I'm not kidding when I say it really didn't matter how good you were. The Baltimore Colts, 2 years prior, literally entered the final week of the season undefeated and missed the playoffs. If the Vikings lose this one, then they drop to 2 games back of the Packers, and they lose the head-to-head tiebreaker. So in actuality, it's as though they'd be 2.5 games back already. The Vikings have to win this one in front of their home fans if they really want to have a good shot at making it to the playoffs for the 2nd straight season, and if they want to defend their Central Division title. So you would think that this game would be played at Metropolitan Stadium, right? Since it is a home game for the Vikings, they played at the Met, just like they played all of their other games. However, there was one small problem with Metropolitan Stadium. Actually, scratch that. There were many problems with Metropolitan Stadium, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, One of the big ones was that, much like a ton of other stadiums were at the time, it was a multi-purpose venue, as not only did the Vikings play in the stadium, but they shared the venue with this team right here, the Minnesota Twins in Major League Baseball. Multi-purpose venue conflicts were not particularly uncommon back then. The New York Jets, during the 1969 season, had to play the first half of the year on the road because the New York Mets were using Shea Stadium for their Cinderella run to the World Series. And in 1970, there was an infamous conflict involving the scheduling of a Monday Night Football game, with a feud between the Baltimore Orioles and the Baltimore Colts. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. But this was no exception. Metropolitan Stadium was used by both the Vikings and the Twins, and while it normally wasn't an issue during the regular season, since the Vikings could easily schedule their home games around whenever the Twins were in town, it was an issue during the preseason, as the Vikings played quite a few of their preseason home games away from home. During that same 1969 season, for instance, they played a game against the Miami Dolphins down in Tampa, and they played a game at Wake Forest, playing some pro football in North Carolina nearly 30 years before they actually got an NFL team. But in 1969, there was an added problem that the Vikings had to worry about with Metropolitan Stadium. And that was the fact that this team right here, the Minnesota Twins, were an awfully good team that was projected to compete for the American League title. The 1969 season was the first time in Major League Baseball that each league was split into two divisions, meaning more of a chance to make the playoffs, and meaning a longer season. And very early on in 1969, it was looking like the West Division was going to be Minnesota's division to lose, as the Twins were a team on a mission. By the middle of July, the Twins were an incredible 57-35, sitting 5 games up on the Oakland Athletics and sitting a whopping 18 games up on third place, as no other team in the division even had crossed 40 wins by this point. And while the Twins being good and looking on track to make the playoffs was nice and all, it posed a major problem for the Minnesota Vikings. Because if the Twins qualified for the playoffs, which it was all but a given barring a massive choke job, then the Vikings-Packers game would have to be moved away from Metropolitan Stadium and to another location, seeing as the Met can't be used while the Twins are in the playoffs. Now you might be saying to yourself that the solution is obvious. Just play where the University of Minnesota plays. Heck, that's what the Vikings ended up doing in 2010 for their Monday Night Football game against the Chicago Bears when the Metrodome was still in shambles, and what they did for 2 full seasons while US Bank Stadium was being built. Why couldn't the Vikings just play at the local college venue as a temporary option? The Oakland Raiders did this in the 1970s when they played a game at Cal, due to the 1973 Oakland A's season having a conflict with it. And in theory, this seems like a smart idea. In theory, just use Memorial Stadium, where the University of Minnesota plays its games, and play the game against the Packers there. However, even though the University of Minnesota had no problem with the Vikings using their venue, and even wanted them to use it, the problem lied with the Big Ten Conference. Because at the time, the Big Ten had extremely strict rules about allowing professional football teams to use their venue. Today, something like this seems insane, but the landscape and the culture were very different back then, and the Big Ten had a rule explicitly stating that no university in the conference could use their facilities to house any professional team. Some of it had to do with an unfair revenue advantage. Some of it had to do with preserving the true amateurism of college athletics. So it was a little bit of both. However, because of this rule, it seemed as though Memorial Stadium, despite being right down the road in Minneapolis, and despite seeming like a viable alternative, was out of the picture. Now don't get me wrong, Minnesota wanted to house the Vikings. As Marsh Ryman, the athletic director for the school, said when he heard about this potential conflict, "I'm going to ask for an exception to the rule. Our battle in this regard is not won, and we still have a terrific selling job to do in every respect. We'll have to convince the entire Big Ten that it's a good thing, and good public relations. This could help us not only this year, but in the future. If the Twins are ever involved in a playoff or the World Series, it could be a lifesaver. But it was looking unlikely that this would happen, especially since twice before, in 1965 and 1967, the Vikings asked Minnesota if they could possibly use Memorial Stadium due to a conflict involving Metropolitan Stadium and the Twins. And both times, the Big Ten said that they could not do that. So the Vikings knew that they were in some trouble for this game right here against the Packers. It wouldn't be at the Met, and it was looking highly unlikely that it would be at Memorial Stadium, barring a complete change of heart by the Big Ten. Which is why the next option for the Vikings was to look elsewhere. And I don't mean elsewhere in the state of Minnesota, since there didn't seem to be any viable venues outside of those two. Rather, I meant elsewhere in the country. And that meant playing this game against the Packers in Kansas City. That's right. The likely destination for the Vikings-Packers game, since the two stadiums that could theoretically house the Vikings in Minnesota were unable to do so, was in a state hundreds of miles away that did not have an NFL team, although they obviously had the Kansas City Chiefs of the rival American Football League. Kansas City Municipal Stadium was not going to be in use. The Chiefs were on the road for the first 4 weeks of the season, as their first home game was not until October 12th against the Houston Oilers. And there wouldn't be any conflict with baseball, seeing as the Kansas City Royals and the Minnesota Twins were both in the same division in the AL West, and there were no wild cards, as only the division winner made it to the playoffs. If the Twins made it, then obviously there would be no more Royals games left, so the stadium would be free. And if the Royals made it by some miracle where they won 60 straight games to close out the year, then the Twins wouldn't make it, and there'd be no conflict with Metropolitan Stadium. In that regard, playing this game in Kansas City made a ton of sense. On the other hand, you have to wonder the obvious question of why this was even a conflict in the first place, seeing as the Vikings and Packers played each other twice during the regular season, since they were in the same division. So couldn't you just have the Packers-Vikings game for Week 3 get played in Green Bay, and move the other game to Minnesota? It's not like Milwaukee County Stadium, where the Packers-Vikings game was going to be, had any conflicts with any other teams, seeing as the Brewers had not moved there yet. So there was no scheduling conflicts to worry about there. This mess seemed like it very easily could have been avoided, and the Vikings playing in Kansas City never should have even gotten to that point. Having said that, as you've been watching highlights of the Packers-Vikings game, you've probably noticed that nothing about the stadium that this game has taken place in looks like Kansas City Municipal Stadium. So if the game couldn't get played at the Met because of the prior conflict with the Twins, and the game wasn't played in Kansas City, then where did the Vikings meet the Packers? Turns out, the game ended up getting played at Memorial Stadium, where the University of Minnesota played its football games. By a vote of 6-4, Big Ten athletic directors voted to change the rules, where if a proposal received approval, a professional team could play a game at the facility of a university in the conference. Now, this wasn't a permanent thing, as once you're in the clear, you're golden. You had to resubmit a proposal for each individual game. So if, let's say, the University of Minnesota wanted to host 5 events involving pro teams, they would have to submit 5 different proposals. Each proposal was a one-off. But in this instance, the university got permission on this one-time basis to host the game. Said Ryman, all of the Big Ten schools promote the appearance of all types of professional entertainers on campus. Why shouldn't they be willing to profit from pro football? And with that, Vikings-Packers could be held in the same state where the Vikings actually played, even if it was at a different stadium, which meant that the fans of Minnesota could watch as their team beat up on the Packers 19-7, in a game that wasn't even that close, seeing as the Vikings led 19-0 before a garbage time touchdown late in the fourth quarter. And considering the fact that the Purple People Eaters forced 3 turnovers and held the Packers to just 173 yards of total offense, all while sacking Bart Starr 8 times, It's not hard to see why the Vikings won this one rather handily. And yes, you have to love the irony in all of this that the Vikings were set to play a game in Kansas City during the 1969 season, and then when the season ended, the Vikings lost the Super Bowl at the hands of the Kansas City Chiefs. Football has a funny way of working things out sometimes. I don't make the rules. Today, the Vikings have a stadium of their own, and they have no conflicts with any other teams using US Bank Stadium, as they are the primary tenant. So something like this will never be an issue again. However, it is bizarre to say the least that the Vikings and Packers played each other twice in 1969, and yet we were this close to having neither of the games take place in Minnesota or Green Bay, seeing as the Packers' home game was in Milwaukee. Because in 1969, when it came to the Vikings' home game, thanks to a conflict with Major League Baseball, we were this close to having Kansas City calling. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.